Welcome to Pasa, HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness. Saludos HSI familia, and welcome back to Que Pasa HSIs. The new presidential administration took office on January 20th, 2025, launching a new era that many of us are trying to navigate, especially those of us whose life work is to ensure the success and justice for minoritized people. But how do we move forward when the slew of executive orders are erasing the progress on equity and inclusion from the last 60 years? On January 20th, President Trump signed what the White House termed the initial rescissions of harmful executive orders and actions, which included the revocation of previous executive orders designed to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, support for immigrant families, justice for non-binary and transgender people, and restrictions on corporations in the name of climate justice. Some of the revoked executive orders include Executive Order 13985, advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, the White House initiative on advancing educational equity, excellence, and economic opportunities for Hispanics, the White House initiative on advancing educational equity, excellence, and economic opportunity for Native Americans and strengthening tribal colleges and universities, White House initiative on advancing educational equity, excellence, and economic opportunity for Black Americans, and the White House initiative on advancing educational equity, excellence, and economic opportunity through Hispanic serving institutions. Executive orders are mandatory requirements set by the executive branch that essentially become law, but without the approval of Congress. They bypass the other two branches of government, but can be overturned by the next executive branch without Congress approval. So now what? How do we move forward as HSIs committed to protecting and supporting some of the most vulnerable populations targeted by these executive orders? Our guest today, Dr. Cristóbal Rodríguez, is a policy expert and scholar activist with a track record of advocating for Latine populations. He was appointed in 2022 by President Biden to serve on those. The committee has now been dismantled and their work has been erased from the federal government's websites. But Dr. Rodríguez is going to talk about some of the progress made and offer tips on navigating these tumultuous times. But who is he? He was born and proudly raised in the Texas borderlands of El Paso under hardworking immigrant parents from Mexico. He is currently Associate Provost for Equity at Western Michigan University and has been a professor at New Mexico State University, a longtime HSI, and Howard University, one of the oldest HBCUs in the country. He also spent 2 years as Associate Dean for Equity at Arizona State University, a leading R1 HSI. He has a PhD in education policy and planning from the University of Texas at Austin, and his research and leadership is centered on the need for systemic equity and culturally responsive leadership and policy across the education system. He has served in important roles, including a 3-year term to the Executive Committee of the University Council for Educational Administration and the Board of Directors for the American Association for Hispanics in Higher Education, for which he now serves as the chair. I'm excited for today's Plática with Dr. Rodríguez, who I have known for many years and who I share a passion for advancing the educational success of Latine students. Cristóbal, thank you for joining us on Que Pasa HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. But first, let's learn about you. So why don't you start by just telling us about your servingness journey?
You know, it's a blessing to be here. I always give credit to the rich experiences that I've had and really calling them blessings. And blessings, you know, for me, it's giving credit to the late Congressman Cummings during my time at Howard University in D.C., who tells us the story as a group in a room full of faculty of color, and saying, you know, at the end of the day, his father dropped him off there in the Howard Yard with that message of, don't forget, you're here to get blessed so that you can bless others. And he speaks to the role as faculty and as scholars and researchers, that our work is to serve and to bless our students so that they can then in turn take that work and bless their communities and their families and, you know, at the end of the day, continue on that good work. So since my time there, I was, you know, call this work sometimes from that perspective of blessings. But prior to all of that, having attended New Mexico State University, I actually started my first year of college at UT El Paso, UTEP. Then transferred to New Mexico State. I felt like I needed to move a little way further away from home. And during my time there as an undergrad, really involved through Latino student organizations, through my fraternity, Omega Delta Phi, that we were actively involved, and then being involved through the Hispanic Council of Students. And from there, we started hearing the concepts of HSI and serving. Now, soon after I finished my undergraduate degree, I started working a student affairs role in the Office of Chicano Programs. It's now called Latin American Programs. And the work was to support the success of our students and as well as improve college readiness efforts in community and partnerships. That really put me in the middle of those conversations of what it means to serve. Early on, having conversations with our colleagues with Native American programs next door or Black programs across the hall, we knew that it wasn't enough to just use this status or recognition as an HSI. We also had to push this concept that went beyond enrollment and really make sure that the work of actual serving students and community was really taking place. And that for me was being brought really quickly within, a few years after the development of the HSI concepts and how they were being implemented and adopted. And that's important to always think about the HSI history as part of why we do what we do, to really push those concepts of servingness. And being in the middle of these conversations early in the implementation of being an HSI, a few years after its implementation, I think it's important to think about that history and how we move forward and the reasons why we had to push, or our community, our elders, if you will, in the 80s and into the 90s, advocating for the implementation and conceptualizing what an HSI is to be and what it means. And I say that because I think it is important to have that historical understanding and how we then navigate today's tumultuous political times. Because at the end of the day, we still have to think about how do we sustain this work despite what happens politically? How do we still build institutional capacity? How do we go beyond just enrollment of undergraduate students? And I know you and I have briefly talked about this. What does it mean to be connected with community and really leverage K-12 partnerships as part of a systemic equity effort? And then thinking about the continuing pathway onto graduate studies, onto doctoral studies, onto the professoriate. That's where we really have to keep pushing, like those policy histories. That's where we have to think systemically. And for me, that's all been coming full circle, from my time as an undergrad, going to my master's at New Mexico State as an HSI. And then the kind of research I did as a doctoral student focused on borderland communities and particularly around the top 10% admissions plan in Texas. For me, that was always critically important, and really understanding back to why is it that we're here to ultimately serve our communities and serve our students and their success.
Yes. Thank you for that. Oh, why haven't I got you on the show yet? This we need to have this conversation, like right there, jump from the jump. You're already like talking about like the kind of things that I talk about and think about, right? Like this idea of K through 12 partnerships, HSIs, and acknowledging our history so that we can get through these tumultuous times. Like that's powerful, right? We have to stay committed to what we do, or we're going to be erased, right? This is going to be an erasure. So thank you for bringing that in like so early, right? For us to talk about this conversation. So you have years of experience advocating for students of color and especially Latino, Latina students. But let's start with some of your more recent efforts. In 2022, you were appointed by President Biden to serve on the White House Advisory Commission on Advancing Educational Equity, Excellence, and Economic Opportunity for Hispanics and Latinos. By the way, when I saw that, I was just like, yes, right? Like I love that for you. And I love that I know you. And I just aspire to do that kind of work that you do. So I thought that was amazing when I saw you were appointed, because I think you really do the work, right? And that was quite obvious when you were like appointed to this committee. And a committee I think is like obviously super important and so close to my heart and the stuff that I do. So I wanted to give you your flowers, by the way, while we're here. But I would, normally have linked the website. I actually looked for the website, and I normally would put the website in the show notes, and it's been archived. And that, really hurt me when I got to that page and it was archived, right? I was like, really like, dang, this is really, I'm talking about erasure. This is happening.
They did that quick. Like, and not entirely surprised. The writing was in Project 2025. The writing was in a number of other discourses. And, interestingly enough, one of the probably highlights of the work of the commission was recommending and advancing and approving the language to create a new commission specific for HSIs. The conversation was, we were a committee of the work where HSIs and higher education focused within the commission for Hispanics and Latinos, but we knew that there needed to be, similar like there are with HBCUs, an HBCU-specific excellence commission, that we wanted to do the same thing. And this was not just from our storyline. This was something that actually was in place since the 90s. In fact, we heard through our conversations that this was something that the Clinton administration had considered, had intentionally waited so that Al Gore, if elected, would then get the honor of creating an HSI Excellence Commission. And then we all know what happened, right?
Yes.
He did not get elected.
No.
And then it never came back around. There was effort to also try to advance it under Obama. Sadly, for a number of reasons, it didn't come through. And then finally, we found the moment, the opportunity, in partnership with a number of our networks, with HACU in particular as well. They played a huge role in our conversations. Antonio Flores met with a number of us and would attend a couple of our meetings in DC with the commission to play that advocate, the president of HACU. So we knew we needed to emphasize the importance of creating a specific commission around HSI excellence as well. Interestingly, when that was officially ordered as an executive order, came through in July at an Unidos conference in Las Vegas, the infamous weekend when things shifted quickly that following week. But that conversation then, when they actually invited us out at the end of October 30th, last minute call, they called from the White House and said, can you be at the Oval Office the next day? Because they're getting ready to have the ceremony signing the HSI commission. And it was excitement, right? To be to be in the Oval Office, to have that official ceremonial signing, to be there with not just HSI leaders, but also other Latino leaders in the room. Very momentous occasion. But on that day afterwards, we had a number of network conversations. When you talk about a research, either research branch of the federal government that do education work, or the associations in DC, or some of the things we're hearing from foundations on that day, there was already flags of concern as to the kind of things that we're preparing to roll back. Already conversations from the different federal funding arms to the situation. Foundations were already rolling back their language or asking their constituents or other organizations to change their mission statements. All those things were flags like, okay, we're going to not only see a shift in the federal government, but we're also going to see a shift in foundations. What does it mean for associations? Hearing also from a good colleague from the DC HSI Latino network, that even the associations were already changing their discourse. So there were these flags already, which is concerning, right? How do we then navigate to come? And this is, again, before the election, even though we just had the ceremony, it's been heartbreaking ever since then. And then thinking, okay, how do we shift? How do we then go from momentous work of the commission, creating this new commission for HSI specifically, among other things that we advanced and recommended, with a good number of colleagues, not just from the higher ed part of the house, but K-12 part of the house, and also economic development part of the work. And so we were being really strategic in that regard, and then wondering what's to come. How do we pivot?
Mm-hmm.
How do we continue this work?
Mm-hmm.
From my personal take, this at the end of the day is reflective of not just an assault on HSIs, but it's an assault on public education,
Right.
K-12 and higher education. And it's not,
Mm-hmm.
the voucher movement, from a number of other policy initiatives. There's an intent to defederalize programs and to shift them over to states. They might not do away with the Department of Education, but they will defederalize many of the programs that are centered around access and equal opportunity, holding up, ensuring that federal laws are met and regulated appropriately at the state level. So there's going to be a lot of those shifts that I don't think they'll actually end the Department of Education, but we'll see a big shift in an effort to defederalize. We'll see a shift to essentially challenge public education, K-12 and higher ed.
Mm-hmm.
Not just HSIs that are going to be feeling the impact on this. It's size altogether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, we have to think about what does that mean for our work as an institution, particularly as public institutions of higher ed.
Yeah.
And we have to come together and really
Yeah.
pivot.
Yeah, for sure. Oh my gosh. I think that's where I've been, in the space of like, I think about HSIs. Obviously, that's my area of research, and I am a huge advocate, as you know. And people like are turning to me like, give us answers, and I'm like, I don't have answers, right? But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, this is affecting all kinds of things, right? Like it's not just HSIs. Yet we know that that's going to be one area of public education that is going to suffer, right? So, but thank you for bringing that, because I think there is so many different things we need to think about.
And because it's so interwoven, there is a whole economy, a whole industry of higher ed, and not just in the fabric of higher education, the fabric of K-12. And driving back to campus earlier, interestingly enough, talking to my mother, who's a nurse and still works today, and she's in elder care, and she supports her community through Medicare, Medicaid programs and elder care centers. And she said, well, what's going to happen to all these programs? And, I said, part of the reality is that even though they said that Medicare, Medicaid's not going to be affected, now food programs, they shouldn't either, because the reality is red states highly depend on federal programming for Title I, for food assistance, and through the Department of Agriculture. They highly depend on funds for Pell grants. I mean, when you start making sense of what the fabric and the whole industry of how the federal government is intersecting across all public institutions of higher ed, K and K-12, yeah, it's going to come back and bite them. At least I think it will.
Yeah.
And you hope that we can then think about, well, what does that mean for our work? If you look at what you shared on your LinkedIn and your social media regarding Haku's statement, you begin to see how we're quickly wanting to highlight how we're all intersected across communities, how we need to think about, at the end of the day, this is for the success of all communities, not just our Latino communities or HSIs, and how we're all interwoven. It goes back to the work of MLK and the Poor People's March. That we have solidarity across the community, and it becomes even more important in this situation.
Yeah, for sure. Ooh, that solidarity piece is huge, and I think that's the only way we're going to get through this, right? I want to contextualize the recording of this episode. I mean, I think people know we record prior to the releasing. Today is January 28th, and today is the day that we heard that the federal government was going to pause all funding to all kind of systems, right? Anybody that gets federal funding, which is educational systems, healthcare, elderly people, kids in kindergarten, right? I mean, like everybody across the board, we all rely on the federal government for funding. I wanted to contextualize that because I think the stuff you're saying is so important, and we need to contextualize the moment, right? This is an artifact in time, that it's been a hard day, right, to hear. And yeah, for the HSI community, we're like, oh no, what's happening to Title V and Title III? And I'm like, yeah, what's happening to all of these things, right? What's happening to Head Start? What's happening to Medicare? What's happening to Pell Grants, right? Like we're all just in this space of like what's happening, right? And so I wanted to contextualize that because I think you bring so much knowledge and are already offering us things like what we should be doing, right? We need to do this in community, absolutely. One thing I wanted to ask you about that commission was when I was searching, right? I was searching for like, where's the archived website, right?
Yeah.
Like where's it at? It's just gone. It's just disappeared. But there was a Facebook page, and on the Facebook page, it said that y'all had written some reports. So since we cannot read the reports, what can you share with us as far as like things we can consider as far as, and particularly for the HSI community, recommendations that y'all were making that we can pick up, right, as practitioners who are listening, as leaders at HSIs? Like what can we pick up from those reports that we can try to run with?
And I shared that with you, and I know the final report as a PDF I do have, and then as well as a resource guide that the Department of Education put together. At the end of the day, they really do highlight the good work to support access, to support the success, and as well as at the end of the day, really do good by what Secretary of Education Cardona would talk about, the promise, right, to a public education. And the promise is that access, that equal educational opportunity to be transformational for families. And when you connect the dots from that take and the work we were trying to advance, we were constantly trying to really move on, okay, how do we ensure that the recommendations we're advancing, and most of the recommendations at the end of the day were coming from our HSI and Higher Ed Committee. We just had a good, solid group. I got to give credit to Cristóbal Rodríguez. He's the president at SUNY Albany, who's highly networked. He came out of Puerto Rico, and his experience and wisdom really played a role in being strategic, and just us coming together consistently. As well as Terry Leyva Ruiz, who's a former community college president in Maricopa Community College System in Phoenix. The three of us in particular really came together to think about how do we talk about the importance of college readiness equity? How do we talk about funding and support for HSIs given the demographic reality across the nation, the growth of our Latinidad across the nation, and how do we advance and put specific recommendations? So you'll see a number of recommendations that support some of the work that the secretary was trying to advance. Around that, we even supported some of the work regarding how do we also address that it's not just a K-12 conversation and into undergraduate studies, but also that it's a big part of this work is the pathway into graduate studies, professional schools. How do we get more faculty? How do we get more university leaders that look like us and speak like us? That becomes part of the conversation as well. So you'll see some of that language that tries to think about the whole pathway, right? And even our support for Puerto Rico in itself. We did a visit in September, and you talk about, for me, getting an idea of defederalization, gentrification challenges, demographic shifts. Bad Bunny just put out a whole wonderful album to talk about the importance of what's happening on the island. But when you see the reflection of public education, what's happening on the island, right? It's lots of demographic of numbers, and the decimation of K-12 and higher ed. The University of Puerto Rico, their elite institution of higher ed, there, how they've drastically not only lost students but faculty and numbers, right? You get suddenly a snapshot. I remember thinking as we were on La Isla del Encanto, thinking, wow, this is really is a disinvestment in public education, K-12 and higher ed, things that have gone on and are going on. This is the assault on public education. And when you then connect to what's going on by this current administration, and unfortunately, Republicans at the end of the day, is to disinvest in public education, which is again the great equalizer, right? To improve access, K-12 and higher ed. So that's the big fear in all of this, where you're having policies at the end of the day that are driving away that promise, right, to defund public education, K-12 and higher ed. So now we're in the situation where if you see less federal funding for institutions, less research dollars for institutions of higher ed, how do we pivot as public institutions to state funding initiatives
Mm,
for
mm,
association and partners and foundations? But if you see foundations also shifting, that's another concern.
right.
Uh, but and you saw that in the Haku announcement, right? That they're also saying this is a
Mm-hmm.
focus on state partnerships, under state
Mm-hmm.
partners,
Mm,
to go back and invest in higher education. As you know, states have given less and less money to higher education. That's why our
yeah.
tuition has gone up. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so there are things that we have to think about. How do we go back to and really start investing in public education? How are we going to be more strategic in this work? So that for us was key, like to support public education, to support K-12 and higher ed, to connect the dots, to think about the need for more faculty, the need for more graduate students, the need to support our communities. Um, and we did as much as we could for the whole time we served, and you'll see that
Mm-hmm.
highlight the number of recommendations that we advanced from the very
Mm-hmm.
beginning in that
Mm,
final report, as well as the work of the resource guide that the Department of Education put together.
okay. And for folks listening, if you want access to these resources, we're gonna figure out how to make it accessible to y'all, because all this work that's done at the federal level is supposed to be accessible to the public. So we'll make it accessible to y'all. We'll figure out how to do that. As you were talking, particularly about Puerto Rico, I was thinking about I had just been digging back into old HSI research for one of the projects I was working on, and this piece that was published in 1998 by Margarita Benitez, that I had read many times, but hadn't read in at least a decade, right? I hadn't read that piece in a while. And so whenever you go back to an old piece, you see things you didn't see before, right? And she talks about in that article about how the HSIs in Puerto Rico actually grew because of the federal support, right? Like that they're only, like, she acknowledges, like, actually these colleges and universities on the island are growing and becoming more prosperous and becoming more viable institutions, right? Powerful institutions, because the federal government has been supporting, right, since 1965. We know, and the Higher Education Act, right, and some of the funding that's going in by way of tuition and financial aid, right, Pell Grants for students, that obviously goes to institutions. So I thought that was interesting as you were talking, because I'm like, the way we rely on the federal government to grow and advance the institutions that are actually supporting our students is so important, right? And we just see this erasure, right? There's nothing else I can call it besides erasure. We're being, like, when a whole committee work is erased, I mean, it's erasure, right?
Yeah, those things help build. From your work, you highlight that those grant initiatives, federal dollars, help build institutional capacity,
Mm-hmm.
help
Mm-hmm.
transform institutions to ensure that not only they're providing the access, but that they're ensuring the success of students.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that also has happened at the state level. In Texas, from my dissertation work on the top 10% admissions plan, it goes back to what happened with affirmative action in Texas back in the 90s, that then resulted into how do we ensure admissions. But at the same time, what was happening in the 90s was there was a lawsuit that, from Maldiv was part of it, the GI Bill Forum was a part of it, a number of state advocates. And so the conversation was, how do we invest to ensure that higher education in the borderlands in Texas was gonna have the support? And what it started with in the late 80s was highlighting how in all the borderlands, in a huge, vast region with a lot of demographics from El Paso to Corpus Christi and San Antonio, that you had only one graduate program in
Mhm.
geology at UTEP,
Mhm.
one graduate program. And if you
Mhm.
want to get a master's to be a school principal in El Paso, you had to go to Texas.
Mhm.
So at one point, I remember growing up in El Paso, and we didn't have principals. Even though we're in a Latino community, we didn't have principals that looked like us.
Mhm.
You either had to go to Texas Tech or Sul Ross State or somewhere else at what would be deemed as a non-HSI
Mhm.
in, in the 80s. But what shifted was from this lawsuit, even though because higher education is not a right, it's that they said, okay, this the case failed, but what they created was a Rio Grande South border or South Texas Rio Grande funding initiative that really pumped dollars into institutions in the borderlands, HSIs like
Mhm.
uh, UT San Antonio, UTEP, A&M Corpus Christi, A&M Brownsville, and Pan American, which is now UT Rio Grande Valley, A&M International, and suddenly you had a robust enrollment. Suddenly you had new programs and degree offerings, not just at the undergraduate level, but at the master's and doctoral levels. And then that fosters and helps develop communities, right? So here's an example where states can also play a huge role in investing in HSIs as well strategically
Mhm. Mhm.
to ensure that there's access because they directly have a connection to how we then develop communities.
Mhm.
So these things matter at the federal and
Mhm.
state as
Mhm.
and how we then think about where we go from here is we have to double down at still advocate at the federal level as much as at the state level, even more so.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
challenge you have states that like New Mexico, having spent a lot of time in New Mexico and done a lot of work both K-12 and higher ed there, they highly depend on federal funds. Their
Mm.
it does what it maximizes as much as it can to fund both K-12 and higher ed, and it's still not enough. It really relies on those federal dollars.
Mhm.
Where there's states like Arizona that could do a lot more for public education, K-12 and higher ed doesn't. Those are going to be some tough conversations that state advocates, which goes back to I got to give credit to the work like Marla Franco at University of Arizona, who's creating these
Yes.
HSI consortiums at the state level,
Mhm.
doing work creating an HSI consortium in Colorado. Those are going to now become even more important. Right? And what does that
Yes.
look like across states as well?
Yes. Ooh, yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for giving us this because it gives us context as far as like the federal support is important. And we gave it, I gave an example and you come back in with the state level support, right? And the interesting thing about the example you give is like, that wasn't like an HSI policy, right? But it ultimately affects HSIs, right? I talk about that all the time, that we don't need HSI specific policy. We just need policies that are going to support the advancement of supporting institutions help that want to advance the success of Latino students, right? And so there's that. I think at this moment, we're going to have to navigate that as well, right? Is like, what can we advocate for, and how is it going to advance some of these agendas, right? That we have as far as moving this work forward. And it's going to be more complicated in some places like Texas, unfortunately, where they have doubled down on anti-DEI right initiatives, and people are now responding and trying to keep their heads above water in trying to do this kind of equity work. Whereas a state like mine, right, like we in California, we're lucky to still be a blue state, right,
Yeah,
and
no,
still
no,
being able
no.
to announce.
Regarding the stuff that's come out regarding what that means for our undocumented students and our DACA students,
Mm-hmm.
looking at
Mm-hmm.
Cal State and UC schools, like let me take some notes over here from what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
However, at the same time, I'm reminded often that there's still ways to navigate even the most red states. For example,
Mm. Yes.
in the midterm election 2 years ago, Arizona um, approved the people voted to approve state funding for undocumented and DACA students. The people voted to say,
Yes.
yes, we have to provide that funding. Texas has been providing funding through their state higher ed system for undocumented and DACA students for years now, for almost 20 years or about 20 years. And yet, I use that reference because yet in Michigan, I say in Michigan, how is it that we
Mm.
haven't gone there yet? What?
Mm.
When? And so I pressed that story. I said, look, if Arizona voted it, if Texas has had it for 20 years, all right, Michigan, who has a significant migrant community, and because of that history, you have children who are DACA and undocumented. We don't have a set state policy that helps inform access and much less funding. So like we need to get together. And if you look at rankings, we're like the top 8 worst states for
Mm,
how we support DACA and undocumented students. What would make us worse is if we were Georgia, what that actually does not allow undocumented and DACA students to attend their elite institutions, which gave
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
freedom in the wonderful work they do. But there's examples where even in red states, you have to figure out how do we maneuver as advocates, as scholars and researchers in partnership with legislators to bring these policy initiatives to bear, even if it's through a vote or if it's something through the legislature and get it approved through a governor. At the end of the day, it has an impact on communities. It has economic impact on the state, clearly. So
Mm-hmm.
we have to also, keep hope in that regard, that there's histories of those that we
Yeah,
can live with. Right?
yeah, for sure. Yes, I'm loving the conversation we're having because it intertwines like the history and policy right together. And you've written about those things, and I've written about those things, right? These are things we think about, right? Like it does matter, right? We do need to think about that as like, where's the history? What's the history of this work, particularly when we think about how do we move forward, right? To build for the future. So thank you for bringing all of that in. So you talked about how you've been involved in these different organizations, right? These associations. Those are what I call the external influences on servingness, right? And you talked about how powerful those associations are, and how y'all came together into this, right? This commission work that the White House commissioned you, right? Like literally come tomorrow and be a part of this. And I think if I had to label you in a way, we hear scholar practitioner, scholar activist. I would say you're a scholar politician. I don't know if anybody's written that, but otherwise I'm pointing it now because I definitely see you as like a political figure, right? Like you move in different spaces and are able to influence a lot of different spaces because of the positions you hold and the different connections you have. And one of those that you have right now currently is the American Association for Hispanics in Higher Education, right? Which is a powerful organization that obviously very much advocates for Hispanics in higher ed and doing a lot of really good work. You currently serve as the board of directors. So talk to us about some of the stuff that AHI is doing to advance some of this advocacy work, particularly for Latine students in higher education, and how we can lean on AHI in this time, right? As one of the organizations that is doing some of this advocacy work.
The wonderful niche of what is this academic community with AHI is that it's for a long time invested in that scholar development, in the development,
Mm-hmm.
supporting the scholarship, um, the book award, that your work has been recognized, right? That, and what does that mean, right? To take that back to our communities and share that and advocate for that, um, as well as making sure that there's a sense of community within early career scholars as well, with our grad fellows and our faculty fellows as well. It's also a big part of the conversation to think about that pathway into leadership. Right? We know we don't have enough, given the number of HSIs out there, given the vastness of what is Latinidad across the U.S., that we just don't have enough faculty and enough scholars and enough leaders that look like us and speak like the communities we serve. Period. Right. So we know we have a niche as an organization to continue to do that. What we've done in the past few years, we really have evolved in a number of ways to be more sustainable as an organization, to think about being more inclusive about our Latinidad, right? Especially when it comes to our Afro-Latino communities as well.
Mm-hmm.
That part of that is being strategic on trying to look at partnering with institutions out of the Southwest, out of California and Texas, where it has been historically hosted as a conference. And so we've done that shift, knowing that that's part of the work of being more inclusive and expanding our communities. We've been having this conversation for a few years now, even about our name consideration. What does that mean for us to go through this
Mm-hmm.
discourse of being more inclusive. And at the same time, it's in relationship with trying to be sustainable as an organization.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then part of that is, and being more inclusive is supporting the contributions and creativity of our early career scholars, and being more involved with not just at the board level, but also in the planning of sessions and themes that are really pushing us critically, right? This
Mm-hmm.
past couple of years, I really have been loving and enjoying and attending sessions where I'm taking notes and they're pushing my thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, I don't think I'm a Theo and this elder scholar, but apparently somehow we arrived there where I'm like, ooh,
You're a
I'm,
Theo. Yes, you are.
I'm like, Moscow. When did that happen? Uh, with that creativity, that energy, even if it's like to call us out, viejos, us Theos out, like we're
Mm-hmm.
like, right, I've never thought about that. I apologize. That was not my intent. Let's see how we can improve and be
Mm-hmm.
systemic and
Mm-hmm.
to change how we operate. So we've done
Mm-hmm.
some of that work and we're going to continue to grow. But that investment in developing our academic community is still a big part of what we're trying to achieve as an
Mm-hmm.
organization.
Mm-hmm.
Know that we're going to have some challenges with a lot of anti-DEI policies. That's less funding that we're able to receive, less institutional members. We're trying to think more as well strategic in how we recruit funds to support not just the conference, but the sustainability of of the organization itself. So it's allowing us to think creative. It's allowing us to think about how we move across different spaces. We're now, partnership with institutions. Will be hosted by Metro State Denver in March
Mm-hmm.
8th, which we're excited about to be at a central location like Metro State, doing some great HSI work with some wonderful people, and bringing that to part of that conversation. The following year, we will be hosted by San Diego State. We know that a large part of our constituency is in California. The
Mm-hmm.
there is excited to host us, and even thinking, how can we then also take advantage that it's on the border community, and
Mm-hmm.
leverage the connection to some of its partner institutions in Mexico, and how do we bring that to the conversation?
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that, yeah, there's a part of the conversation has been, yeah, we got to get back to California because that's a huge part of our community. And we know it's not that easy for cost, especially for our graduate students and our early career faculty, to be able to come up with the funds to attend the conference. And it's tough for us to even manage all of it together. Even though we've done some improvement, it's still always a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we're eager to get to the East Coast. We're eager to try to be in DC or New York, where it'll help us to be more inclusive and really connect to our
Mm-hmm.
Latinidad
Mm-hmm.
colleagues and their work, because we need that. We need to push that racial inclusion work as a Latinidad concepts, and to expand that, right? And to think about not just our Latinidad diaspora, but our African diaspora and connections there, and as well as our indigenous connections. So those are things that we're pushing constantly. It's exciting to have to be in this point in my career and do this work, knowing that I was a grad fellow early on. At the very beginning, when it was announced that it was going to become its own organization in 2004 in San Diego, when it was AAHE, the American Association for Higher Ed. Then the following year, it started creating its own. So this year is our 20th anniversary, and
Mm, okay.
come back years down the road and be involved now at this level, and to see where it's come from, and to
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge histories and try to continue to do again the development of our academic community. Right, it's critically important.
Yeah, for sure. By the way, this picture back here behind me, this is my Ahi Book of the Year award from 2020. My favorite award ever. It's so beautiful. It's very intentional. There's a whole message on it. I know that y'all don't do that anymore, the art, but that was so meaningful back in the days, when y'all used to give those kind of awards. But I appreciate that you sort of contextualize he as like a scholar space, right? It's definitely a space where early career scholars go, graduate students, because I think we need to understand the different advocacy groups that we have, that we are advancing, right, advocacy and speaking up with and for HSIs. And it brings me to the question of like, how do scholars be better advocates for policy, right? To my point of view, being a scholar politician, right? How do we better influence policy, right? I'm in the wannabe space for sure. Like I think my work is policy relevant, but I don't know that I'm really, like, am I really pushing at the policy level, which for my work, obviously that's the most important, right? How do I advocate for more HSI, better HSI policy or state level policy? You name that. I'm like, that's a dream in California. We don't have HSI state level policy. We got the most HSIs, right? So how do us as scholars, because you do it well, be better advocates, right, for pushing for better policy and equitable policies?
A big part of it is establishing relationships, spending that time with building relationships with key legislators, key advocates, not just legislators. For me, I was really always interested in acknowledging policy and the power of policy. How it started was I was directing a federal grant, and this was 20 years ago. That changed me forever. Working in tribal communities and migrant communities, working in communities like Hatch, New Mexico, and Sunland Park, and Mescalero Apache, and as well as Alamo Navajo community as part of the Navajo Nation Dene community. And knowing that the educational system was intentionally failing our communities and our kids. And realizing that we were defunded under the Bush administration, for me, was the hardest thing to date that I ever had to do in my career, was to tell these high school kids through this residential program, getting them ready for college so that they can go into the health professions, so that they can go back and be solutions to the communities. That was the goal, right? To be part of the formula to create solutions to tribal nations, to our migrant communities. And then we were defunded under the Bush administration because of politics. I knew at that point, fight and struggle was in policy and politics of education. So during my doctoral program, establishing my early relationships with folks and advocates with MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, because of those conversations, and then it's having the opportunity to learn from wonderful colleagues who were doing fantastic work, like Norma Cantu, who was a MALDEF litigator and then was Assistant Secretary of Education overseeing civil rights during the Clinton administration, knowing that we had to be involved and establish those relationships. So when I went to New Mexico State as an assistant professor, continuing those relationships became critical, and then being part of a big educational opportunity lawsuit against the state of New Mexico, and then providing the expert witness report in that. Establishing networks across not just MALDEF, but across other state legislators and advocates, and building those relationships. So when the governor was trying to implement, the first Latina governor, Republican governor, was trying to implement, let's hold back third graders, quickly being able to come up with my research to say, let's shape this from an equity standpoint, and let's see how accessibility to early child education, accessibility to high quality teachers, how that shapes third grade reading proficiency levels. So if you want to hold back kids, let's first fix that contribution to that relationship, and then having the research to then share out with those networks to then change the conversation, right? And then from there, building up those relationships. So when I ended up in DC, continuing, okay, who do I connect with? Who do I build relationships with? I got to give credit to Cristóbal Alex, my tocayo from El Paso, who was president of the fund, who then became deputy secretary of the cabinet under Biden, right? And then you build those relations to other people, especially through Howard University and through the networks in DC. That then provides those opportunities for me to then have my name in certain circles, right? And so those relationships have consistently been a big role in the conversations that I've been a part of, whether through some of the research advocacy work that I did in that educational opportunity case in New Mexico, to actually sharing my research with folks in Texas when Maldiv was trying to inform top 10% admissions policies and that policy there, or in DC and being mindful of what MSIs are doing, being part of an HBCU with a lot of networks and recognition. Doing that relationship building becomes really critical to advancing our research, so it doesn't just stay in a publication, so it isn't just read by our students, but actually playing out in policy conversations and the work that needs to take place, right? So those relationship building is the key to all of that.
Right. Yes, that relationship building is essential. And I think that's something, as you were talking, I'm like, I love this. I love this conversation. And I think I'm definitely one of those people who is like, I'm not very good at that, right? At the relationship building. And you probably are like, Gina, you be talking to everybody, but not in the political spaces, right? It's just not, it doesn't come natural to me. And something I've been thinking about a lot is like, and maybe this is something that he can take up, is like, how do we better train people like me to do that, right? Like, I'm like, I would do it if somebody asks me like, hey, Gina, you want to be a part of this? I'll be like, okay, cool. Right. But like to reach out and try to be a part of that is harder for me. Right. And I think we need to have to think about that. Right. And I'm going to put it out there and say, I think it's gendered. I very much think it is, right. That maybe we aren't trained to do that, right? Particularly as women, as women scholars, women of color, that we kind of just wait, right, to be asked.
As well to Sarita Brown and especially Deborah Santiago, though, as these women who have really pushed the conversation on multiple levels and have done a remarkable job to play a role with that. And they realized that we need more policy-minded folks and scholars. They have a policy fellows program now. And we've talked about how do we partner with, say, our grad fellows to have an experience with their policy fellows to be able to share notes and compare notes, because we know that, especially even more so now, we need to arm our scholars with that policy lens to be leaders in particular, to be able to know how do we frame this from a policy lens to take our expertise to what it means now to either state policy advocacy or federal policy advocacy. And so we know there's a huge need for this, right? So give them credit for starting that. It's not enough. It's clearly not. I'm lucky that I had that experience before I started my PhD program that really said our fight is in policy and politics. That thrust me into that area, as well as leadership, right? Leadership is a big part of that, which is why I then contributed my works into framing Latino educational leadership as a concept and as a framework, and to then invest in preparing more Latino, Latinx, Latinate leaders, because that becomes critically important as part of that formula, right? But it's a process, right? It's a process that we have to invest in, we have to support and advocate for. Right, it's still very much gendered. It's still very much not enough at every level. It goes back to there's simply not enough scholar advocates that look like us and speak like us. When you look at the rate of who goes on to graduate studies, Latino, Latinx, Latinx students go on to graduate studies at half the rate compared to other groups. It's not enough, right? We have to address that. We have to be strategic, but we have to think about what is that. Like I've shared this with Deborah Santiago, and I think you and I have talked about this. How can we add that the servingness definition and concept also include not just undergraduate information, but how many of our students does an institution sending on to graduate studies and professional studies? That needs to be part of the seal of excellencia. That needs to be part of servingness concepts. We desperately need that. We can't be at half compared to all other groups at the end of the day for graduate and professional studies.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thank you for that. I think you got my mind going now, because I'm like, okay, I have to do better, right? I had a conversation with
We all do.
we all do. It's
do.
like, what's my role? And how do I do it? So I do appreciate program. I didn't know the program that Excelencia had started. I'll definitely look into that. I talked to Will Del Pilar at Ed Trust and Brian Cook at Urban Institute at ASH, and we had the same conversation. I was like, y'all, like, can you help? Like, let's get a program for scholars to do better policy translation, because there was a presidential session that they were on, and I was like, it was such a good session. I wish more people were involved, and also like we need to be trained in this way, right? So anyone listening who has the ability, like, yeah, we need more programs. We need more of us to be able to be scholar politicians. I'm telling you, I'm coining it right here. That's going to be the title of the episode, because we do.
When UCA was in DC, they had Elijah Cummings speak to him, and he called us out as an academic community, University Council for Educational Administration.
Mm-hmm.
He said, how many of your all's work, dissertations, is just published and then just put away? At the end of the day, we don't see any of that in the Capitol or in state legislators to actually inform policy. Right. And so what does that mean for us to advocate for our work in those spaces? That's where those relationship building like really becomes critically important, to be able to work with folks to say, hey, very quickly, I know the governor's trying to put this policy through to hold back third graders. How about we address the inequities that contribute to third grade proficiency rates, reading proficiency rates? And let's address access to early child education and access to high quality teachers and distributed across all schools and not just concentrated in one school or two schools. And so that's the kind of framing, that's the kind of equity mind, that's the kind of research and data that we need to bring to the table quickly. And then to be able to have that ready for legislators, or to be hand in hand when things are coming down in a way that are going to be problematic, that we already are working together to be able to provide that research or to share our work. Beyond just okay, we got a publication, it's going to help me get tenure and promoted, but it's not enough. We have to, what's the impact in the policy space, not just what we call the impact factor of a publication. Those things become critically important to reshape that as well.
Yeah, for sure. Ooh, that impact factor will have much more traction if it was impact on policy, right? Because we don't necessarily get that same level of impact. So thank you for engaging that conversation with me. I think one more thing I wanted to ask you, because some of our listeners are daily asking me, what's going to happen to Title V? What's going to happen to Title III? What if the Department of Education is dismantled? Does that mean these programs go away? I don't know that you have the answers, but would just love to hear your thoughts on where we potentially could end up, right? And how we respond. I mean, you've already said some of it, right? It's a lot of organizing. We're going to have to rely on state level because that's where they're heading. So just thoughts on that, on potential dismantling of the HSI construct, really, and the funding of it.
That as approved legislature has to take an act of Congress to change that. An executive order is not enough. However, this sends a signal when you have complete Republican control of not just Congress, not just the executive power, but judicial power as well. So being mindful that there's ways through that now. Can they get it done in the next, next 2 years of that Republican control?
Right.
Who knows? But what they can do is, in this case, halt funding, right? Or at least slow down funding initiatives, or not give out any more funding. So, it's going to have a clear impact on how public institutions, public universities in particular, or higher education is going to function over the next couple of years. And pivoting to being strategic with, again, those state, and as well as thinking foundations, right? But it's not the end all, right? A lot of the work that we have to think about building institutional capacity is things that we have to sustain independently outside of federal funding or foundation funding, to be able to institutionalize roles and people where it's part of the role of the institution and mission of the institution to ensure that it's improving student success, to ensure that it's elevating access-oriented concepts and policies, to ensure that it's establishing partnerships that really shape that access and equity work, has to be part of the conversation as well, and not just dependent on say, the federal funding to be able to build that institutional capacity. Much of the work and the lesson that I'm getting now in my role at Western Michigan has been that, okay, we're not an HSI in the state that had really rolled back affirmative action a while
Right.
back. So how do we build still institutional capacity? How do we connect the dots to ensure that we hire key folks, not just say from admissions that can be culturally and linguistically responsive to all of our communities. We also look at our pre-college initiatives to also build our K-12 partnerships as well, to invest on that institution, because at the end of the day, we're a public institution where enrollment is critically important, as well as our students. So it's acknowledged that we can do this work even when there's isn't that federal funding aid. Is it easy? Is it going to be tougher? Yes. Is it possible? Most definitely, that we can push ourselves as institutions, as leaders, and as advocates and practitioners to really think, okay, how do we still do this work? So it's not just dependent on an individual, or not just dependent on a federal grant or any grant. And same thing with our own roles. I'm reminded constantly that a big part of building institutional capacity is how is this going to be sustained, right, over time? How is this beyond, or how is it just on a particular individual or scholar? We have to continue to invest on building, long-term, sustainable, transformational work as institutions to really make sure that they do serving. And that's where I give credit to like the Seal of Excelencia model, because it's going to push not just looking at enrollment, it's not just looking at retention, not just looking at transfer, not just looking at your graduation, but also what are your community partnerships, what are different dimensions that institutions have to demonstrate that there's a clear commitment and intentionality to not only do the work but be measured by that work and produce the work and sustain it, and not just a one-time thing because of a grant, but a long-term sustainable institutional transformational work as well. So those things we have to be pushing and advocating for in this process.
For sure. All right. I love it. I knew you would give us some good food for thought on that, because people are so worried. But I keep saying, like, you're still gonna have to do the work, right? Like, you're still Hispanic serving, or at least Hispanic enrolling, if anything.
At the same time, in all honesty, I've had some sleepless nights this past couple of weeks. Dreams. I had a dream last week where I'm back at Howard University talking to my colleagues, saying to three distinct good colleagues of mine from Howard, saying we have to keep our mission in mind as an institution to centralize race and our identities as part of this work and the preparation of our students and the kind of research we have. Like, I'm literally having this dream, having this conversation, reflecting on everything that's going on, and having this conversation that's bringing back to that moment, right? But seeing how important that is, right? Yeah, it's keeping me up as well, and many of us, because we the voices of our students. We had a case last week of actually 2 weeks ago, before the inauguration, where we're hearing what our students are going through here at Western Michigan, and trying to think, how are we going to respond to this? What's our how do we address this so that we can ensure that not only this student has the support needed to be successful and continue their success, but what does that mean for all of our other students who are silent, who are traumatized, who are fearful? Like, I take those things to heart, because I've heard them. I've heard their parents. I've been in communities where, it almost feels like their one line of hope is this one string that's barely hanging on, and we're trying to figure out, how do we make sure that such students are going to be successful at the end of the day? Because it's not just an important matter for themselves, it's an important matter for their families. That's familia investment, familia sacrifice. And I just, it's not just here. Let me tell you, at Howard University, I always loved and appreciated the power of family networks. It was uncles and aunties pulling in to fund the education of that one child to go to Howard University, right? And to make that sacrifice. And I loved how they would sell these shirts at graduation that said "Proud Aunties." And you see the same familia networks and sacrifices here. I love graduation commencements, because you see the familias come out, the abuelos. Our students, even on campus, are, when our fraternity had their crossover event one night on a Thursday in November, it's cold out, it's rainy, And I see an abuela walking up. I see a tia, and I see some kids. I'm like, when did this happen? When the fraternity started having like the familia celebrating who's crossing over in their chapters, and it's not just that. So you begin quickly see like, oh, that family capital, like that's so huge. And then this is why we do what we do, right? That takes, and the students are living it and pushing themselves, and we have to honor that, right? We have to continue to push that in our worlds, regardless of what role we have. Those become critically important aspects of the work we do and why we do it.
Yeah. Listen, if you're having dreams and premonitions, it definitely puts you into that Theo elder space. All right.
Yeah.
That's what our elders do, right? To have the press. So I love it. I appreciate it. Lean into it and
I
share.
had a
You got to
vision
share
last
them stories
night,
with us, like you
right?
just did.
Our indigenous roots speaking to us. Hey, by the way, speaking
Yes.
of indigenous
Yes.
roots, if you haven't noticed my wonderful
Mm-hmm.
mug that says "Decolonize Your Tongue," I got to give credit to Calabash Tea out of DC that
Oh.
fit to make an herbalist and a naturopathic doctor. I have what I call an open door tea policy. So it goes with your decolonize HSI work. I thought I'd give
Mm,
you a nod. Decolonize HSIs. All right.
yes. We gotta decolonize everything, right? Everything gotta be decolonized. We gotta decolonize the federal government at this point. Let's go. But the other thing that you had me thinking about, talking about the aunties and the abuelas coming out to support students, was the work of Jose Cabrales, who talked about the madrinas and the padrinos, right? As far as, and he talked about in the alumni context, right? Latino alumni. And I've pulled from his work and talked about that at HSIs, is like, how do we get people who communal give, right? Communal giving. We don't need rich alumni. We can do that communal giving if we operate it from that model,
Yeah.
right? That we got to start thinking differently, right? The way our community thinks, because that's how our community shows up. We show up in community like that. I think his model is so. I wish more people would talk about it, right? That's why I'm putting it out there right now. As far as like the padrinos show up, right, and support the whatever, the quinceañera, right? Like, and you have everything is taken care
I
of by
love,
those padrinos,
I
right?
love
Like that we
I
need
love
we
our
need that
students
model,
because like
right?
last
And
week,
we can draw on that.
Katie Kai chapter, my sister sorority, and looked at Basso in our student center. I'm like, yo,
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
how much? Like I'm gonna give you a donation. Anna, yes, give me one, but without the mayo. Just make it with butter and lime. So, and then like the president comes in and is like, what do you call this
Same.
again? He bought one himself too, and he's like, this is really good. I'm like, right on. And then I asked like, hey, who made this agua fresca y'all are selling? Oh, it was my mom. My mom made it, right? Or someone's tia pitched in when they're selling tamales,
Exactly.
and you know, you're right, that
Mm-hmm.
familial capital, a huge part that explains our success and why we do what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Leveraging that is critically important. We know that at the end
Yeah.
of the day, from I've seen this from doctoral student research where they looked at HSI giving by Latino communities, where HSIs who acknowledge the support and contributions of
Mm-hmm.
philanthropy are going to have per capita more contributions. They acknowledge that Latino families do give, or more
Yeah.
likely give, tend to give more to churches often. And the same with the Black community in HBCUs. HBCUs
Right.
acknowledge that, will give. The thing is, most institutions, most PWIs do not
Mm-hmm.
capitalize on, talk about a missed opportunity to really drive that transformation, to
Mm-hmm.
be able to think uniquely,
Mm-hmm.
how do we drive new scholarship funds and opportunities? How do we create new initiatives and programming? Those community partnerships, missed opportunities at the end of the day for us to really.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yes, that's a way. That's the decolonizing, right? We can decolonize this HSI concept, even, right? As far as like getting funding from the federal government, the funding can come from other places, these communal support, these familial support systems. And then the cool thing would be that then students can decide what to do with that, right? Like if we did a whole campaign to bring in some funding, right, to support our students, then yeah, then let them drive some of the, like, what are we going to do, right? Because we know some of these HSI funds don't go directly to support students. That's a reality, right? We know that. HSI funds go all kind of ways because they can. It can build the capacity of the campus, and it can never even, like, it can completely miss Latina students altogether, depending on who's leading that stuff. So Such great ideas. I love it. I knew this conversation was going to be exactly what it has been. And I appreciate you showing up and having this conversation with me. But before you get out, you got to answer the final question. ¿Qué
Remember we
pasa,
talked about the
HSIs?
Orale Awards? Orale, right? To use that as a way to say, like,
Yes.
the work of our communities and our institutions and the people that make them great, critically important. Right? And giving an Orale Award and shout out to all that sacrifice. I can't tell you the number of people I come across who are doing the more than the 9 to 5 job, who are putting in the weekends, putting the late nights. I mean, it's 10:30 my time here. I don't mind it at all because it's our passion. It's why we do what we do. And a lot of people are putting in their time and money for the love of our communities. And at the end of the day, that love for our community, for our people, for advancing this good work, just got to continue it, right? That that's what's rejuvenating. That's what empowers us. That's what drives us. Much orales to all of that, right? And from that space of love and coming from that recognition of power and advocacy, and we have to remind ourselves of that, or else it's easy to get lost on the madness that is happening right now, especially coming out of the White House, right? That love for HSIs, the love for our communities, that orale, double orales, right? Orale.
Orale. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you so much for being here with me